Welcome everyone to Unit 4 of our Climate Change Communication course. It's wonderful to be back. This is Susi Moser with the next set of lectures for this unit. Today we will spend a lot of time talking about communication channels. And I want to begin by orienting us, as I usually do, with, why are we doing this? What are our course goals? As you remember, these are actually derived from what I heard in the pre-training survey that you all sent me to see what you want to learn about. And a whole number of questions were about the questions of, well, by what channels, what forms and platforms for communication do we use? And so today that's what we want to focus on. And that relates actually to two of the different goals that we have. It, in many ways, as you will see, relates actually again to the question of emotions and values. It also very much must be channeled, as all things. By now you will be maybe sick of me hearing me say that, but it's always audience specific. What particular channels people use and the ones that they have access to. And so we will relate the question of how we communicate via what and for what end in this particular unit through this lens of the channel. In the larger arc of our training, we're now in Unit 4. We'll talk a little bit about the opportunities for engagement and then the channels, both talking about the basics of that, and with that, what your options are, your possible considerations in choosing one or another, or maybe several. And as we've come to this several times already, the importance of the messenger for credibility, for a congruence of our framing, but the messenger and the channel actually are related too, and who you send, if you will, to deliver whatever messages you have. As with every one of these steps, it is an iterative process. You might find by thinking through the channels that you might have to adjust your goals, or you might have to, by looking at the messenger, you might have to think again about who your primary audience is. So we'll go around this a number of times. And just to begin, let me just review sort of the important pieces that we gathered in the last unit, which was very much focused on this fourth course goal, which is all about emotions and identity and motivations. How do you add the juice to your communication? How do you deal with emotion, both your own and others? And it is very much related to, really how big this problem is that we have to face, and how to deal with that. So often we are threatened in important ways in our identities, in our livelihoods, in everything we own and love, hold dearly. And so it's inevitably there. And as I made clear the last time in the last unit, we are actually made up of both. We don't only have brains for cognitive understanding. The other half of our brain is made up and is the home of, if you will, of all these emotional aspects, these passions, these affects that we have, and we make better choices if we address both. So, if nothing else, taking away from the last unit, I want you to really think about how to be always conscious that emotion is in the room, even if it's not spoken, and how to then work with that constructively. And it feeds into, the question of how do we then deal with, once we have people all motivated and engaged and passionate about something, how do we help them lower the barriers to action? So that is really the work that we did last time, and now we're going to refine that even further through the question of channels. You did a lot of different exercises. As I said today in a Zoom meeting, the arc of these 5 exercises was to go from you being conscious of your own emotions, and I heard some beautiful expressions of that, the awareness of your own way of being and how that shows up in communication, to really being with the other in that emotional place, making space for that, creating a safe place to have it, and then to channel that into the communication and the actions that you want people to go in, and to let that inform them. So really emphasizing that this is not just something you do as a checklist, emotion check. No, this is really about you using that and working it in order to motivate more, in order to channel people's desires and interests in a particular direction. You don't necessarily know which ones they are, but if you use their emotion, you have all that energy available toward taking that action. So that's what we did, and I look forward to seeing some of that in your final summary of your strategy. Today, the goal is really to focus on these opportunities and forms and levels of engagement that are available. We often go by default with, one or two that sort of we have traditionally used. But what if we were more creative with that? What if we used a variety of different opportunities and found ways to intensify, make it more active, the engagement, the communication, not just sort of, the one-way delivery of information, but to really think through how do we make this something where people become actively involved. And we'll look at different communication channels that are available, including the traditional media, social media, relatively passive forms of engagement, where information sits somewhere and is offered up for someone to find, and then a very active form of engagement, which is dialogue. We'll come back to the question of messengers, which builds on some of the audience work we've done before. And then I want to invite you to iterate and pull it all together into one coherent, powerful strategy. Where that sits, and you've now seen this at least 4 times, this particular diagram. Really our focus today is in those 4 boxes. And you might wonder why. Well, obviously communication channels is an aspect of communication. Traditionally in the study of communication, that is where you would find it. But as you will see, some forms of engagement, some channels are much more motivational and conducive to action, and some actually might involve barriers for people. What if you don't have access to certain forms of communication channels? I mean, just think about it in this very course, right? Where we're dealing with data constraints, we're dealing with not a good enough internet. Very challenging. One of the communication channels that is not possible during COVID is me being in Seychelles and having this one-on-one direct interaction with you. I'm sure the conversation would be quite different and your experience would be different. So communication channels really shape how we engage with something and how productive that is. So this is just to locate it in that larger picture of what we're trying to do. Now, let's get started with this question of forms and levels of engagement. There is really a very diverse menu available to you. And I want to start out with your own. You have given me a very diverse menu of all the ways in which you already interact with people and have opportunities to communicate about climate on one-on-one conversations. Maybe when you're staffing expos or theme days or exhibits, festivals, events. Some of you are more on the writing end, whether it's brochures, leaflets, posters, websites, newsletters. These are the more passive ones, if you will. Some of you are very actively engaged, like I am right now, in providing trainings and workshops. So obviously a very different opportunity of engaging with something, and both formal and informal in those settings. Writing policy documents, outreach programs. Some of you either do or give media interviews. Some of you are on the other side of the media interview, that is behind the microphone, behind the camera, and have your own ways of trying to want to shape a story, right? Or you're formally or informally teaching, reporting, campaigning, marches. I mean, those are, this is this wide variety that you have at your fingertips. Social media, I wanted to emphasize too, we talked about that today, how important that often is in Seychelles to mobilize people and to get them engaged on an issue. Now, I guess I want to ask you to think for a moment with me about whether or not engaging whoever you're talking with on climate change, whether that is any different than engaging people on other environmental issues, on social issues, on economic issues. I mean, in some ways, the management issues that you're facing with climate change, adaptation, it's not all that new, right? Some of the issues are a little bigger, and certainly the duration is bigger, like coastal erosion. You probably have dealt with this before we ever talked about climate change, and now it's more like it's a permanent issue and it's going to increase. And how do we deal with that in the long run? But it's, not so fundamentally different. And what have you done in the past to get people in the room to deal with that? It's hard, right? It was hard before ever climate change ever came on the scene. Some of the issues in climate change, as you have noted in today's Zoom call, does involve some things that people really don't want to give up. I call them sacred cows. Sometimes it's property, sometimes it's people's livelihood, sometimes it's cultural things we take for granted that we don't even want to begin to touch or talk about. And maybe we have to, simply because the circumstance now forces us. But those issues were there. They were not, they were not, I mean, climate change didn't invent them. People have demands in this context. For example, that government lead or be a role model, do their part, the private sector do their part. In particular, they're not just interested in their own self-interest, but that they work or do whatever they do also for the larger common good. There might be demands on the NGO community or community-based organizations to cooperate in ways that, are not hostile, not sort of on the other side of the table, but really come together to solve issues together. But I'm pretty certain pretty much the same groups need to be involved. You might say, no, there's some others, some additional ones. That may be true. There may be some that have not been involved and now they could be. But for the most part, I have a feeling that you're going to meet the exact same people as before. And for now, at least, you're also doing that in the same legal context, meaning that the laws and regulations that exist, they're at least there right now when you think about adaptation mitigation. So at least for the foreseeable future, many of the things that need to be done now are not so different because of climate change than what you had to do before. Some are, invariably, and people have different reactions to the familiar versus the new, the thing that they're unfamiliar with. Some people get really excited about those new opportunities, and that's a way to maybe tap into the positive emotions and the positive desires for change, while some other things people just simply reject, not because they're bad, but because they don't know them. They're simply unfamiliar. So that's the sort of context in which we try to engage. I think it's really important to remember that there are familiars in many things you already know, and that can be a legacy to how you engage. If you've always fought with people on, I don't know, this or that environmental issue or energy issue or infrastructure issue, I don't think it's going to be, you're not going to start from a level playing field. You're going to bring that whole history into the room with you. And that's really important. Another thing I want to say before we get into the question of types of engagement and forms of engagement is, well, who shows up? Who comes? First of all, let's say who you might want to consider to engage. Sometimes we don't put a lot of attention on who are the stakeholders really that need to be engaged on an issue. Of course, some of them are just because they live in a certain place where maybe a particular action is to be taken, and so that makes it obvious, or because they have economic stakes. Those things are more obvious. Some people have an interest in the outcome, even if they're not personally affected by it. There might be financial risks, there might be non-economic benefits, or social-cultural implications and meanings, and that gets more tricky, right? I mean, do you know that always? What meaning people attach to certain places or to certain issues? Some people might just want to get engaged, or you might want them to be engaged because they have a broad concern for environmental issues, and it's helpful to bring them along. Some people simply have a legal or professional obligation or interest and authority to be engaged on issues. So, these are the formal stakeholders, if you will, just by virtue of their positions and authorities. And then there might be ethical and moral concerns to get a whole other set of people involved. But think about that. There might be a ethical and moral concern to involve future generations in their own voices, but they're not here yet. So who is it that gets to represent a stakeholder who can't be there in person? It's a really important thing to think about. How do you account for that? Do you account for that? Those are the places maybe where we can do better. The other thing I want to maybe emphasize is there are a lot of reasons why people don't show up. Of course, the most engaged, both pro and con, will be in the room, your typical set of players. But there are many reasons why people don't come. And I want you to think about that, because what can you do to help create a space for those people to come anyway? So, for example, people might distrust whoever convenes the conversation or the meeting or the workshop, or they don't like who else is coming. Maybe they're just skeptical or fatalistic about the outcome and just, why bother? Why should I come and spend time there? They don't feel it will make a difference, or they had a really disappointing past experience and thank you very much, but I'm not coming again and wasting my time. They expect maybe that there will be conflict, and they don't particularly enjoy that. So again, a really legitimate reason not to want to come. Or maybe they look at the list of invitees and say, well, you don't have this person, that person, this group, that group. I'm not coming. It's never going to be a just procedure if they're not at the table. Of course, that's something one could fix, right? There are some really practical things too. Sometimes, meetings are called at, I don't know, in the middle of the day, everyone's work day. Well, a lot of people need to be at work. They can't come. So having no time or the resources to come, maybe they don't have the practical access, they can't get public transportation, or they can't afford to come because they don't have a babysitter, or whatever the sort of very logistical issues are that might make it difficult. Some people only come when you tell them they have to, that it's expected. And if there isn't one, well, then they don't feel compelled. They might also feel, and this is actually more common than you might think, when people feel like, oh, this is a technical issue, oh, this is a scientific issue, oh my goodness, there's nothing I can possibly say, I don't understand this, and I'm not going to go embarrass myself in public. People might just not want to come and simply to avoid that kind of public embarrassment if they don't understand the issues. So sometimes you need to actually give people enough information that they feel, or create some kind of comfort for people that they don't need to be technical experts, that they are expert in the things that you want to talk about. Some people just don't care. That's an issue, or they might be shy to speak out in public. Now, there might be cultural issues. It certainly is possible here. I don't know if people in Seychelles just feel like, can't wait to talk. So it's those are all the issues, and some forms of engagement might also be more conducive for people to engage than others. Michelle and I had a conversation today about the importance of engagement through art. In North America, it's almost like art is reserved for the people who call themselves artists, and if you try to engage people in some kind of public art or some kind of engagement in storytelling and theater and songwriting and whatever, public poetry, they might find that very small people, small group of people might find that interesting. Whereas, in your context, in your culture, this is common. This is absolutely legitimate and a very successful and effective way to engage people. So some of this is also cultural. I just want you to be aware of all the different factors that play in. How can you address some of these hesitations before you get anybody in the room, before you talk to anybody? So just to keep in mind. I want to give you a sort of, if you will, a ladder of engagement, a way of thinking about from the most uninvolved to the most involved forms of engagement that you can imagine. From people, well, even maybe at the bottom of this particular pyramid here, not even observing, being completely oblivious to anything going on. But if you get just to the first level of, they're just sitting out there in the wings and watching what's going on. They're just observing. Maybe, if there's a social media track, maybe they're even loosely following sort of the conversations. They're reading the newspaper articles. A higher form of engagement would be if they say publicly, yeah, I actually agree with that. I'm putting my weight behind that. A yet more active form of engagement might be for people to actually actively contribute. Okay, I want my voice to be heard in this proceeding. I'm going to come to the meetings. I'm going to go and do something about it. And if that succeeds, they might actually be so engaged they come to own it. In other words, they feel like they made it happen. You might be the ones that made it happen in the first place, but eventually, if you engage people actively enough and they, really become passionate and in sync, if you will, with that process, and they really want it to succeed, then you might say they are beginning to own that process. And then finally, at the very top is if other people actually lead it. That's you at the moment. You as communicators, you as motivators, you as leaders in your agencies and your organizations, you're at that top. But your task is to bring people up this pyramid, if you will, until you co-own it, until you co-lead it, until it is all of yours, right? So if that's the ultimate goal here, think of all the different ways in which you might actually do that. In this particular table, what you see here is, if you will, that ladder of engagement from the least engaged at the bottom to the most engaged at the top in different contexts. You might involve people in scientific research, or in citizen science, gathering data, in doing things, in decision making, in actions, in planting the mangroves, in cleaning up the beaches, or whatever it is, or in things like, being, which is somewhere in between. There's the research that needs to provide the first basic understanding of something. The assessment really is, okay, pulling all the different research together. Where are we? What do we know? At what level are we? It's the kind of thing that the IPCC does, right? It doesn't do its own research. It assesses what other researchers from all these different disciplines have found. But there are obviously less involved processes that you can imagine doing for your own country, for your own communities, in your own sectors. And then moving that all the way into decision making and enacting that. So in each one of these, you can be relatively passive and just let people observe and follow what you're doing, getting them more engaged, getting them to be, consulting them and maybe convening them, hearing them, and then all the way to being in a sort of more leadership roles where they co-own and co-lead the effort. So there's such a menu here of options. And from when I look at your list, many of them are sort of in that lower part. the least engaged, newsletters, websites, whatever. But some of them also were more in, the dialogue, the one-on-one conversations. I think someone mentioned they did surveys. So there's, you are in some ways across this entire spectrum, but many of the typical forms of government communication, NGO communication, is so often in that more passive place. And what I want to impress on you is that there are ways that you can use the whole plethora, this whole menu, and to move people up the pyramid to more active engagements. Because once people are actively engaged and they own something, well, then you have practically won it. Then you have them there, then you get them into that place of wanting to do something about it. So that's sort of our goal for engagement. I want to say a little bit more about, at what level can you engage people? There are so many different places and parts of our beings and our days and daily being in the world, being with each other, that can be engaged. And that's really important to think about. So often our communication just focuses at that understanding level, at the cognitive level, helping to impart knowledge. And you all have come to see now how that's maybe not all there is. What we've already dealt with is, there's that whole other emotional level, that grabs people in their hearts and in their bodies to get them engaged on something. But there's more. There's the behavioral engagement, right, where you actually are looking at day-to-day actions, whether it's the actions of, professionals or the actions of property owners or the actions of government officials. But really, there are places where you can change people's habits. And then there's the professional, where they can make periodic or permanent changes in whatever, putting a solar panel on their roofs, or changing the procedures in an organization, changing policy, right? These are the kinds of things that really have long-lasting impacts. But it's a very different thing to think about, how do I engage a person at home and the particular circumstances there and how you reach them there versus reaching them, by their official email in their day jobs. And through the lens of the possibilities and constraints that they have as professionals, right? So your access to people in all these different places is so different. Just think about it. And there's more. Social engagement. We talked already about social media a little bit, and we'll talk much more about that today. But, friends getting together, all the ways where you hang out, where you connect socially. I guess we all are much more aware of that right now in this age of social distancing. So in what ways can you always tap into the power of peers and of social reference groups, because they are such enormously important influences on us? And of course, different opportunities, right? Then there is this moral and spiritual opportunity where it's really, why are we here as human beings? How we want to be while we have this life? And how do we engage with each other, with nature? Those larger transcendent questions. And again, where do you find people? I mean, we have lots of people here in this group who are associated with faith communities. Probably many of you, even if you're not leaders in those communities, attend church services or have connections in that way. And some of you may not actually go to any formal religious services and still call yourself spiritual. So how do we touch that? Because that is some of that higher goals, some of those meaning-making, deepest motivations. What access do we have to reach that? Civic engagement, of course, which is very much focused on the community, on the commons. What are your opportunities there? Where do people get together to talk about what happens in your communities, in civil life? And then, of course, the political. So I think it's really important, if you think through your communication strategies is, can you reach people via different channels on all these levels? Or which of, which three do you need in order to get moving on the particular thing that you want? And how can you make that as active as possible, as, up that pyramid that you saw in a previous slide, as much as you can? So that's our goal, that I want you to think through the forms and opportunities and levels of engagement and to try to make that as active as possible in this particular exercise. Exercise 12, which you find in the Google folder, where I basically just, want you to get together with your partner, now still socially distant or in person, whatever is locally allowed. I want you to discuss the forms and levels of engagement that you have available to reach your primary audience that you have chosen. Maybe there's more than one form, and maybe there's multiple levels at which you can engage people. On the handout that you get for the exercise, the previous table and graphic is on there to help you think that through really carefully. So think through, what's the most active and intense form, if you will, and level of engagement that you can possibly find for your purposes? And think through why you're using that. Is that form of engagement actually aligned? It's not about making people busy. This is not about just occupying their time. Can you make that purpose-driven? Why? How? So bring both your expertises and your thoughts to that, and discuss sort of how you can make that. And then once you've chosen one or two forms and levels of engagement, then I want you to actually sit down and design it together with your partner. Where would you do it? How would you do it? When would you do it? How often would you do it? Can you make it as active as possible? Maybe you come up with an agenda. Maybe you come up with, here's a step-by-step process of how we're going to do it. So that's the goal for this exercise. So I want you to go do that exercise, and then when you're done with that, come back to Unit 4, Part 2. Thank you so much.